So today we are talking about Desiree's baby. This is for your third essay, which is going to be due April 16th. So hopefully you've read Desiree's baby over your spring break and had plenty of time to have fun. I think it's only about 4 or 5 pages, so it shouldn't have took you more than maybe 30 minutes to read through it. Today we'll be talking about some of the different literary concepts that we discussed in our video Thursday before spring break. So we'll be talking about similes, metaphors, symbols, irony, different things like that. We'll also be talking about analysis and how that we're going to apply that to our story. So basically, for this essay, what you're doing is you're writing an analysis, but not just any analysis, a literary analysis. And remember, for a literary analysis, we have to break the piece of literature down into its parts to better understand its whole. And the way that we're going to do that is by using those literary concepts we learned about. So, what we're going to do for the video today is you're going to hear me and a guest speaker talk about Desiree's baby. The guest speaker is a local high school teacher who teaches ninth and 10th grade English, and he is going to help me to discuss Desiree's baby so that you guys can better understand it. Now, typically in a normal classroom setting, you and I would be having this conversation together, but I thought it would be better for you to hear at least two people discuss it so that you can kind of learn how to break this down for yourself and also hear maybe someone who has read through it a few times and the things that we're seeing. Make sure that you take lots of notes so that you can use this in your essay. Also, make sure that you start doing your research immediately. So, after watching the video today, you probably need to go ahead and start doing research for that next essay. And for Thursday, you guys will be actually going online to the online writing lab at Henderson with the writing center there. So I'm going to want you to go online, and I know that you're not going to have a rough draft yet, but what I want you to do is to go online with them and start talking about this paper so that you can start getting your thoughts organized and learning if you have good research or maybe where to find research. But you need to go ahead and get started on this paper because it's going to sneak up on you if you don't. Now, keep in mind that during this process, if you have any questions, you can always email me, and that's probably going to be the best way for us to communicate. You can also message me through Canvas, it goes straight to my email, and I should be able to respond within 24 hours. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed the story. This is one of my favorites. So let's go ahead and dive into the discussion. Would you like to say a few words to the class?
Hello, everyone. Excited to discuss Desiree's Baby, also one of my favorite short stories.
Okay, so I will ask him a series of questions that basically I would ask you guys. And he's going to give me answers, and then I may add some input on that. So keep in mind for this essay, I want you to structure it by first coming up with a thesis. Your thesis should be focused around one theme that you find in Desiree's Baby to be most important, and then also answering the why. So for this thesis, you need to answer two questions. Which theme is most important in Desiree's Baby in understanding this short story, and why is that most important? For your body paragraphs and your topic sentences, I want you to focus on one literary concept that is discussed in that writing about literature chapter we went over. And make sure that you're using your examples that can help prove your thesis, okay? Because sometimes we'll find symbols, sometimes we'll find similes, irony that we can recognize, but it doesn't necessarily come back and prove our thesis. So make sure that your examples are proving your thesis. Make sure your research is proving your thesis. So let's dive right into it. What do you Well, first, I guess we need to talk about the work and its author. So, what can you tell me about Kate Chopin or Desiree's Baby?
Um, well, the story itself, Desiree's Baby, is set on a plantation in Louisiana.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of Kate Chopin's stories are set in Louisiana.
Mm-hmm.
I think that comes from personal experience because she moved there as an adult. She was born in 1850 in Missouri.
Mm-hmm.
Um, at the age of 20, she met her husband and they got married and moved to New Orleans, Louisiana.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they had 6 children in the span of 8 years.
Hmm.
So
Lots of kids.
lots of kids. And then her husband died a few years later.
So I can imagine it was hard to take care of 6 kids with no husband, being a woman in the late 1800s.
Right. She actually ended up having to move back home with her mother and with her 6 kids.
Mm-hmm.
And then her mother also died,
Hmm.
which left her extremely depressed.
Right.
Her depression, although tragic, actually ended up leading her to where she is. How we know about her today is because after she went to the doctor, they actually encouraged her to write to help with her depression, and she started writing stories. Over her career, she wrote stories for kids, stories for adults, all different
Also a
types of
few
things.
novels, right?
Also, yes.
So I can assume that her husband died and left her a fortune since she's taking care of all these kids without a husband or a mother.
No, he actually, when he died, they were $42,000 in debt. By today's standards, that's almost $500,000.
Right.
So they were very, very far in debt. The success of her writing is actually pretty much what helped them stay alive.
Right. So the writing suggestion from the doctor was beneficial not only for her health but also for her finances, right? So Kate Chopin is also known for being a feminist writer, and we can assume a lot of this has to do from her newfound independence and freedom that she got from becoming a writer and being able to financially support herself and her children that way. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about the writer and her background, you already told us a little bit about the setting of the story. Can you delve into that a little bit more? You told us the where. So when is this happening? And how does this setting relate back to who our author is? How can understanding our author help us understand the setting of the story that we're talking about, and maybe a little bit about why that's important in this story?
Okay, well, the setting, just based on context clues, does take place in the antebellum South during slavery and on an actual plantation.
Okay.
That relates back to Kate Chopin's because although she didn't grow up on a plantation, whenever she got married, her husband actually managed several small plantations. So she was around it, and she spent a lot of time on plantations in Louisiana. So it only makes sense that she would write about a plantation.
So even though she wasn't from Louisiana, she understood the culture very well because she lived there for a while.
Correct.
Also, we can assume that her time with her husband there was probably some of her fondest memories. And so she revisits the places and the memories by writing them in her stories. Okay, so now that we understand the setting and we understand the author, we might want to talk a little bit about themes so we can kind of narrow down some themes for our thesis. So what are some of the major themes that you see happening in this story?
Well, definitely feminism.
Absolutely.
Racism.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond racism, colorism.
Right.
So even among
Let's talk about
race.
let's talk about what the difference is between racism and colorism.
So racism is usually defined as treating someone differently based on their race.
Which obviously we know during the antebellum South, during slavery times, this was a very important aspect of knowing the culture because obviously slaves were slaves based on their race. right?
Right.
It did not matter their color because you could be,
One drop rule.
yes, the one drop rule meant that you could be as white as a sheet of paper and still be considered a slave because of them keeping papers on you and knowing that your ancestors were slaves. So the slavery thing was completely 100% based on race. Now, what's the difference between racism and colorism?
Colorism is a lot like racism. It's treating someone differently based on their color and not necessarily based on their race. Colorism is seen among people of the same race.
Sometimes, yeah, and it can also be. It's also prevalent outside of the race.
Yeah.
Sometimes people who don't consider themselves racist are colorist because they may not hate all black people, but they definitely prefer lighter to darker.
Right.
Okay, so colorism is basically going to be when you prefer certain shades of people, and it doesn't always have to be lighter. It could be darker too. So if you prefer someone to be darker skin or lighter skin, regardless of their race, that is colorism. And we see a lot of this in society and the media. Oftentimes when people are given parts in movies and show up on commercials, we're going to see the lighter version because typically in Eurocentric Western standards, that's what is seen as acceptable. Okay, so we see a lot of both of these in this short story. We've talked about feminism, colorism, racism. Any other ones that we want to discuss? I know one that I often notice is toxic masculinity.
Yes.
We see a lot of that happening with Armand, obviously. Any other themes?
One that is often missed, I think, is the theme of a mother's unconditional love.
Yes.
Because it's so.
Well,
subtle.
let's broaden it up to love in general, right? We've got different types of
Different
love.
types of love.
Yeah, we've got the unconditional that we see between a mother and their child. That's not just displayed between Desiree and her child, but also between Valmont and Desiree. But we also see toxic love,
Correct.
right? And this is the love that is displayed between Armand and his wife,
And also Armand and
his child.
his child.
Yes. So we see different types of love. And something that kind of goes along with love is family, right? We see some familial heritage, ancestral heritage, and pride involved in this that could be considered a theme. A lot of Armand's actions and the way that he treats Desiree is not necessarily due to a lack of love, but a lack of pride in his ancestral heritage and being able to carry on that name that he's so proud of. Remember, there's one part where it actually says one of the oldest and proudest names in Louisiana. So that was a big part of the South. We have to keep in mind that the South during this time, it was very much built on what was seen as acceptable or unacceptable and what was seen as the nobility class, because even though we didn't have a specific class system in America during that time or during this time, we still saw classes happening in America. So in the South, people who were plantation owners were considered a higher class than people who did not own plantations, and they were considered, the people who did not own plantations, a higher class than the slaves. So everybody kind of had their own class, and that we still see that today, right? CEOs are considered to be of a higher class than the regular working people who work underneath the CEOs, and they're seen to be a higher class than the people who clean the buildings. So we're familiar with this class system, even though there's no technical class system. There's mobility within it. But the heritage and the ancestry and the family was all part of a theme. So any other themes we want to discuss, or we feel pretty good on that?
No, just piggybacking off of love and blindness, and how love can make someone blind or make them willingly be blind.
Right. And this kind of goes into the feminism as well.
Correct.
In this specific story, some people have trouble finding the feminism. But we have to keep in mind Desiree is not
Ideal
a.
feminist.
Right. We would not say she's the ideal figure for feminism, but it's more or less that she's the opposite. Chopin is using her as an example of what we do not want to be as women. We do not want to rely completely and solely on the men in our life to give us some type of purpose. But we also see some feminism with Lady Valmond, right? Lady Valmond, during this time, it was not necessarily deemed acceptable to just find a kid off the street and pick them up and take care of them and say, okay, this is not just a kid I took care of off the street, but this is my child. I love her. I'm going to raise her as my own. And that decision itself is a type of feminism. She stepped in and became kind of a trailblazer there. Also, we see some feminism in the way that LeBlanche is among her people. LeBlanche is a slave, but she has her own cabin and she has her own line to the master. So she, within what constructs as her ability, she controls what she can, right? Okay, so moving on from themes. So you remember, you need to focus on one theme. Come up with your own thesis on that. Talking about why that theme's most important and understanding the story. But keep in mind, your theme doesn't have to match one of the ones that we talked about today. Your theme can be completely different, but you do need to have supporting evidence to back it up. You need to have enough to talk about why you think that's important in understanding this short story. And remember, theme is basically the main idea of the literary text and what the author is trying to get across to us, the reader, in understanding this story. So moving on. So we've talked about themes. Let's talk a little bit about the plot. So let's give a plot rundown. Remember, plot is the fictional narration. So the storyline, what's happening in this short story?
The story takes place over, it seems like, a long period of time for sure, because the very first event that happens in the plot is Monsieur
Valmond
finds Desiree beneath
the pillars. Yeah. On their property, though.
Right. Now, then she grows up for 18 years before she meets her future husband, Armand. Then they have a baby.
Well, we don't know that that's the first they met.
No, it's definitely not the first they met, actually, because...
But it's the first time he really saw her.
He really saw
Yeah,
her and they fell in love.
So he meets her. They're in love now.
They're in love. They get married. They have a baby together. And the real problems don't start until the baby's about 3 months old. And then Desiree starts to notice some physical changes in the baby, but also some changes in Armand's personality.
Well, not at the same time exactly, right? She notices her husband changing first. The way he treats her, the way he treats the baby, the way he's treating the slaves. Because right after the baby was born, he was over the moon, thrilled, loving, actually more loving than he had ever been. Mm-hmm. But then all of that starts to change. She notices that first. Mm-hmm. Then she notices the physical features on the baby. And what's to come of this? What is it that she notices about the physical features that change?
Whenever the baby is...
It's the color.
It's the color. The baby is starting to become a little darker. And she's comparing her baby to a quadroon, which is a mixed race baby.
Quadroon
the
literally
slaves.
means
One
quarter, right?
Right.
So 25%. But she notices this because there is a little quadroon boy in the room with her and the baby at the same time, and so she starts looking between the boy and her baby and realizes they're the same color, and it strikes her all of a sudden as odd that her child is the same color as the little boy who is her slave. And so she is obviously beside herself. So then what does she do?
She tells the boy to leave the room, and then she goes to Armand and finally questions it. She grabs him and says, "Look at our child." This is on page 179. She grabs him and says, "Look at our child. What does it mean? Tell me." And he responds and basically says, "The child is not white. It means that you are not white."
Okay, and I want to stop here for a second because it's important to notice he doesn't assume he's not white.
Not
He
at
assumes
all.
she's not white. Why?
Because where he found the way that they found her.
Because when she was adopted, obviously, they had no idea where she came
They didn't know who
from.
her parents were, anything.
And an important part of this is that her parents actually wanted and suggested that they trace her ancestry before the marriage. But Armand refuses and says, "Oh no,
Because he didn't care.
I don't care about that. I don't. And why is this? This plays back into that colorism. He saw her color and thought there's no need to worry about that, right?
Right.
So, okay, back to the plot. So he says, basically, the baby's not white, so obviously you're not white.
Right. And Desiree is just devastated by this.
Obviously. And we need to talk about why she's devastated. Obviously, she's devastated for the sake of her child, right? She doesn't want the child to be deemed illegitimate. But what does this mean for Desiree herself?
Everything's different. Her whole life is different.
Specifically, what does it mean? During slavery times,
If you could be traced to have even one drop of black blood in you, you could automatically be sold into slavery.
exactly. So this means that not only is she scared for her child, she's scared for her own safety, future. She has to realize that if this is true, the illegitimacy of her child is not the only thing up for grabs. It's also the illegitimacy of their marriage. She
Correct.
could become one of Armand's slaves.
And not only that, but then she could be separated from her baby as
Yes.
many slaves were.
Yes.
And the baby
So
sold
her
to a
fate would be the
different
same as any other slave.
Mhm.
And she realizes that immediately. Okay, so moving on. How do they deal with this? How does Armand deal with this? Is he nice about it?
I'm not going to say he's nice about it, but he's not as mean as he probably could have been.
You're right. He's
See?
a master. He could, I mean, he's been shamed.
Yeah.
He could have immediately said,
He could have immediately snatched
Yeah.
her up and whipped her or something else.
Yeah.
But she asked if if she needed to go, and he just asked her if she would leave, and Desiree left and went and found her baby, and they left the plantation.
okay, we skipped a big part. Desiree writes her mother.
That was before she asked if she should go.
Right. So she tells Armand. Armand says, "You're not white." She's devastated for multiple reasons. And then she immediately goes off and she writes her mother, Lady Valmond. And she says, "Mother, these people are crazy. They're saying I'm not white. Can you please tell them I'm white?" And her mother writes back,
And tells her to come home.
right. We don't know if Desiree was ever even informed of her background, right? We don't, it's never
I don't think it
specifically
ever
said,
mentions it.
but we can kind of assume the way that,
Well, Armand knows, though. So if Armand knows, you would think that Desiree also
you would
knows.
think so, but it's
But
never
it's never
specifically
explicitly
said.
said.
You're assuming that the husband and wife talked,
That's true.
back then that's not necessarily true.
It's 2020.
So, So we know now she wrote her mom. Her mom's answer was not "you're white," and I'll tell them. It was "come home. Bring your child. Come home. We want you here."
Back to your mother who loves you.
Yes. And so
That's at
then
the bottom of page 179.
after she gets the letter, she brings the letter to Armand. And she says, "Armand, look, my mom wants me and the baby to come back home. Is this something that you want me to do?" What's Armand's response?
Yes, he tells her to go ahead and leave.
And for Desiree, this is devastating because Desiree's entire life is wrapped up with Armand and what he thinks of her, how he feels about her. Remember, there's that part where it says that Desiree's happiness depended on his happiness, and when he was sad, she was sad. So him telling her that he does not want her to be with him anymore devastates her to the point that she does what?
Again, it's not explicitly stated, but I mean, it's pretty clear that she kills herself, commits a murder-suicide, kills herself and her baby.
Bye.
She walks off into the bayou and goes off into the water.
And I don't know many people that could walk off in the bayou wearing a nightgown and some slippers with a baby and survive.
Right.
Okay, so we're going to assume that Desiree and her child are dead. And she's committed this murder-suicide. She's walked off into the bayou. Well, obviously Armand's going to be devastated, right?
No.
So how does Armand act?
He's not very devastated. He actually, just a few weeks later, decides to
Have a
start
bonfire?
a big bonfire and burn all of Desiree's stuff and all of the baby stuff.
Yes, heartbreaking. So that's the end of the story, right? Sad. Oh, there's another twist. Okay, so what happens as he's burning all this stuff?
As he's burning everything, he comes across an item that's not Desiree's, but it's actually from his mother.
Right, he's reaching into the drawer, picking out all the love notes they've wrote back and forth, him and Desiree. And at the very back, he finds one that isn't Desiree's. And who is that one from? You said
it's from his mother. And
his
it's
mother
to
his father.
This is on the bottom of page 181. He read it. She was thanking God for the blessings of her husband's love. And then it says, in quote, "But above all," she wrote, "night and day I thank the good God for having so arranged our lives that our dear Armand would never know that his mother, who adores him, belongs to the race that is cursed with the brand of slavery."
Dun, dun, dun.
Which means Armand's mama was actually
Black. Right.
Which
Now, we
means
don't know that
Armand
she,
also
colorism wise, we don't know what shade she was. We don't know how dark she was, right? More than likely, she was light herself. But fact of the matter is, she did have black heritage. And if we look back at the story, it's mentioned that his father had moved to France with his mother because
when they came back.
the rumor mill said that she was from France and didn't want to leave her country. But we find out now that it's because she was black. Now, some of you may not know this, some of you may know this, but France was much more liberal during that time period, during the slavery time period, in allowing mixed couples, biracial couples, to live and be married and raise their children there freely. So this is why we can assume that Armand's father went to France to live with his wife, who was Armand's father or mother, a slave. So, okay, so let me break this down for you. Obviously, tragic story, right? But let's talk about some of the characters and how they apply So remember, underneath our literary concepts, this would be characters, okay, and a character analysis. So we have the Valmonds. These are the people who took in Desiree and loved and cared for her like she was their own child. And we see that this doesn't matter to them even once it is suspected that Desiree is not 100% white. They're still welcoming her back with open arms. Good people, right? Lady Valmond is the first one to really notice what's going on with the baby.
Mm-hmm.
We noticed this in her visit to Desiree. She's surprised.
She literally says that's not the baby. Or something.
Right. She says that's not the baby. And Desiree thinks it's because she's bigger or the baby's bigger, but it's really because of the baby's skin tone. So Lady Valmont's had at least a few weeks to think about this. Okay, moving on from the Valmonds, then let's talk about the Aubigny's, because we have Armand and we have his father and mother, but the father and mother are not present. So let's talk about what this actually means. And we have to understand the way slavery worked and masters to their slaves. So the masters and the slaves had a relationship all on their own. And it's talked about in this story that Armand's father had a good relationship with his slaves. Right. It even talks about the carefree days were over once Armand came into the position of power. So basically, Armand's father was much more lenient with the slaves, and we know why now, because he was willing to marry someone. Remember, Armand, even though he thinks he married someone who has black heritage, it wasn't by his own volition. Right. He feels duped or tricked into that. His father, on the other hand, did it all on his own free will. He knew, and that's why he and his wife moved away. We have to keep in mind that plantations were passed down. So we can assume that Armand's father had someone there to take care of the plantation, more than likely his own father, while they were gone to France. Then after the mother dies, he moves back. We assume that the mother was a slave on the plantation that he took off to France with. Some things that we need to think about is some of these characters who are mentioned as minor characters in the story. For instance, Zandrine, right? Zandrine is the nanny, the one who takes care. And we actually hear that she's yellow, the yellow nurse, right? She's mixed as well. She's going to be about the same age as Armand. So what can we assume here? If she is a mixed woman, the same age as Armand, living on the same plantation, and has been a house slave this whole time, taking care of babies in the house.
Grew up with her.
Armand grew up with her. Where did she come from? I mean, what's the logical answer here?
It's probably Armand's sister.
Probably Armand's sister, but she's darker than Armand, so we have to hide her in the house as a slave, right? And it may have been that Armand came from one woman and Zandrine came from another that he wasn't as fond or familiar with. I mean, we can't be sure, but some things happen. But we can assume that Zandrine is probably more than likely related to Armand through the master's bloodline. Then we talk about another minor character, LeBlanche, right? And this is another reason this whole short story has to do with feminism, right? Because we have a lot of female characters in their different roles and how they react in those roles. So we have LeBlanche. LeBlanche is a symbol. We can kind of delve into that for a second. The name LeBlanche is a symbol for what? White. Okay. And we are told that she's very white. Why what?
Does that mean white? B-L-A-N-T.
Yeah.
It's prefix.
Well, it's a foreign language, right? And it means...
Blanco in Spanish.
Right, but we're talking in French here a lot, so LeBlanche, white. So here we hear of a woman whose name is literally White, right? Or the White. Mm-hmm. Again, she's a slave, more than likely because she has Her ancestors have been raped by their masters so often that it has diluted her to the point, her bloodline to the point that they are technically what we would consider Caucasian walking around, right? But because of their bloodline being traced and they have papers because they're owned, their property, she's still technically a slave. But if you look on page 179, it talks about her having her own cabin. And
177.
I'm sorry, not 179, 177. And it talks about it about a third of the way down on the page, and it says, and the way he cries, went on Desiree, is deafening. Armand heard him the other day as far away as LeBlanche's cabin. Now, first of all, did slaves have their own cabin back then?
Not generally.
Okay. Why would a slave, a female slave, have her own cabin?
If the slaveholder had a particular relationship with
A mistress, let's just call it what it is. So he's sleeping with LeBlanche and has put her up in her own cabin. The reason the masters would do this is because the wife would be aware. Now, people who were as light as LeBlanche were almost always given a position in the house. But considering that she's got her own cabin, we can assume she was placed off the plantation, or at least far enough off the plantation near the big house that the wife didn't have to see her every day. And this was common practice. This isn't something that people talked in hushed whispers about. This was something that was very common. Masters often had quarters somewhere off the big house for their mistresses.
And she knew. I mean, here she is.
She knows about it. She's
right
talking
here in this
about it as if
conversation
it's
is telling
commonplace.
her
This is
mother
this is
that,
very
yeah,
common.
He was down there at the cabin.
Yeah, he was down there with his mistress and he heard the baby screaming. He's got such good lungs. I'm so proud of the baby. Yeah. So, again, let's delve into this, and it can get yucky. Where did LeBlanche come from? I know, you're looking at me. It's gross. Where did LeBlanche come from?
I don't know.
She's almost, well, we know she's as white as Desiree, who did pass for white and got married to Armand.
Yes, but we don't know that she's always been on this plantation.
We don't know that. Maybe she was bought because people who had slaves that were that white often sold them, right?
Yes.
That is not true. That's a lie.
Yes, they did.
No,
were a
they
higher
didn't.
Commodity. Look,
Okay.
Hotel. They were a higher commodity because of their skin color. They went for higher prices.
Okay, so maybe he fell in love with this slave and bought her to be the mistress. Or maybe what's another alternative? You know what I'm getting at here. What's another
I'm not gonna
alternative?
go there because I don't think that's it.
Okay,
Personally.
but let's go there.
So what do you think?
Keep in mind his father's not around anymore. We don't know that he would know this, but we can assume that it might be his sister, right?
There is a possibility.
Right,
Yes,
because
it
she is so white. Her father obviously had to be white. Her mother probably was also considered white like her, but a slave. And therefore, she might be his sister that he has a mistress with. But there's also another alternative. Maybe there was a light enough slave, male, and a light enough slave, female, who gave birth to her.
It's possible.
That's a possibility also. But that would also mean that they were still within his family, right? Because
Yep,
those people would have only become that white if the master's blood had been mixed in with them enough. So again, these are all things that during that time period was not even thought about twice. But we as modern readers, my guest is disgusted over here. We as modern readers have to think about this. We have to consider all the angles, right? Because that's our responsibility as a reader. That's what analyzing it is. We're breaking it apart into its pieces. And one of those pieces is discovering who the characters are and thinking about them. Okay, so there's another minor character I want to talk about before we talk about the two main characters, and that is the little boy. LeBlanche's little boy, right? What page is that on where it actually discusses LeBlanche's little boy? It talks about him on
middle of 178.
middle of
Close to the bottom
178. One of
178.
LeBlanche's little quadroon boys, half naked too, stood fanning the child slowly with a fan of peacock feathers. This child is who? We've already established LeBlanche is
Oh, it's Armand's son.
right. It has to be Armand's son because did the master share his mistress with anybody else?
No,
No. So
not even other slaves.
not even other slaves. So the master's mistress was his property only, his to be raped only for him, right? So her having children, this is probably Armand's child, fanning his other child, who is the legitimate heir, right? Okay, so now let's talk about Armand and Desiree as characters. Desiree obviously is an important character. She is a mysterious character to us because we don't know her background, but we know that there's a lot of symbols that indicate she's pure, innocent, right? Because a lot of times she's referenced with the color white, right? And the color white is a symbol for what? Almost always in all literature, purity,
innocence.
right? So, and it's like the saying "white as the driven snow," right? That means like pure, clean. We use that reference a lot in our language today, so we can assume she, as a character, is supposed to be seen as pure. Armand, on the other hand, doesn't seem at first like he's a very mysterious character, right? We seem to know he comes from a good bloodline, one of the proudest names in Louisiana. He is very strict with his slaves, which is ironic, come to find out that he is actually black, right? But he's very strict, and he falls in love quickly and hard. So he seems a very straightforward individual, but then the mystery of Armand actually comes in at the end when we find out that he is himself black, or at least his mother was black, so he has black blood in him. And we then begin to connect all the dots about what this means for Armand and his entire situation there, right? So he becomes more of a mysterious character. These two characters, Armand and Desiree, what would you say about their relationship? Like we were talking about the themes of love.
There's a blindness on both parts because of love. When he first falls in love with Desiree, he doesn't want to know her background and doesn't care to know because he's so in love.
And because
he
of
said
colorism.
It doesn't matter. And then
Had she been darker, we can assume that he wouldn't have even fell in love.
Even fell in love with her.
Right, but because
Now,
of
on the
her
other side of
appearance, and this whole love thing is all because of her appearance, right? I mean, he doesn't fall in love with her personality.
No, because he knew her before he fell in love with her when she was 18. He
Exactly.
just was struck like a pistol.
Right. So he's passing by and sees this figure and just falls in love with her physically. So physically he falls in love with her. So we can assume this love is not really love, is it?
Right.
What would we
It's
call
more
this?
lust.
More lust, right? And obsession, right? As hard and as fast he
That's
falls
a
in
good
love
one.
with her, he also is controlling. Just as he's controlling with his slaves and his property, he's also controlling with his wife, right? He controls her every emotion. Think back onto the bottom of page 177. This was what made the gentle Desiree so happy, for she loved him desperately. When he frowned, she trembled, but loved him. When he smiled, she asked no greater blessing of God. So when a woman or any person it feels that strongly about their partner, it's almost always a sign of abuse, right? They fear them, but they love them, and their every emotion is controlled by that individual. So we can assume he's a very controlling individual based on everything we know about Armand as a character. Um, and everything we know about Desiree as a character is she was the pride of her family, right? Remember that? At the very beginning of the story, it talks about she was the pride of Armand, the idol of Armand. Page 175. For the girl grew to be beautiful and gentle, affectionate and sincere, the idol of Armand. Notice we're describing a woman here. Do we hear strong? Do we hear intelligent? No. Why? Why is that important in understanding
Because
feminism
those were
in the
feminine
story? And
characteristics at the time. Those
right,
were things that people revered in women.
exactly. And this, you know, goes into a term that you guys are probably not familiar with, the cult of domesticity. But basically, that means that there were certain attributes that were placed on women at the time. And a lot of times in literature, you see one or two figures for a woman. Okay? She's either the Madonna or the whore. Okay? And here, she's clearly being portrayed as the Madonna. She's the idol. She's what every woman should try to obtain. Or every man should try to obtain, and every woman should try to emulate.
Purity, piety, submission, and domesticity.
Yes. Now, what he just named there, say it again louder for my class.
The four main tenets of the cult of domesticity are purity, piety, submission, and domesticity.
Right. So let's break that down quickly for them. Purity, meaning virgin,
Right.
keeping your legs closed.
Right.
Piety, meaning
Religious piety.
close to God, being the person in the house that it leads the religious side.
Submission, being submissive to your husband.
Allowing them to control you.
Right.
And
Domesticity, doing all the domestic household.
making the
duties,
house a home.
cooking, cleaning.
Right? And we can see some of this spilling over in today's society, right? It's often still seen as the woman's job to do all this, right? Now, there are some people who hold those values very dear still today. But I think for the most part, our society is beginning to begrudgingly accept that women can have a place outside the home, that they have thoughts and needs of their own without having to submit to men, right? So slowly we're getting out of that. But you have to keep in mind, we've only had the vote for like 100 years, almost 100 years. So we're just now getting to the point where women are seen as their own entity. But during the time this story was written, by the woman author that it was written by, we see all these characters in Desiree. She is the epitome of what a woman is supposed to be in society. And her only blemish is that we don't know her background and her history. Okay, so now we've done a character analysis. We've broke down basically what's happening in the story with the characters. So let's quickly mention a couple of symbols. He's calling time, but he doesn't realize that this class is an hour and 15 minutes.
Oh, that's right.
Right. Okay. So let's quickly talk about some of the symbols that we see happening in this short story. Just name some of the most important, because we'll leave some of those Easter eggs for them to find on their own. But let's give them a few examples. Some of the major ones.
The columns.
Columns are obviously a big symbol. They're mentioned in the beginning of the story when Desiree's found. She's found in the shadow of a column. And then later when Armand falls in love with her, it's also in the shadow of the column.
But also the shadow itself is a symbol, not just the column.
So let's break it down. What's the column a symbol of? I'm going to do this because we all know columns are straight up and down, round figures, right? What can we say that is supposed to be?
A phallic symbol.
a phallic symbol. For those of you who don't know, a phallic symbol is something that is representative of manhood. It's supposed to be representative of the penis, an erect penis. So the column is obviously a phallic symbol, okay? Now, let's talk about the shadow. What is the shadow? What is that symbolic of?
Well, it depends on if you're talking about just the shadow or the shadow of the column.
Well, obviously it's the shadow of the column.
The fact that she's in the shadow of the column means that she's in the shadow of men.
Right.
The whole story.
Right. She is in the shadow of the patriarchy.
Correct.
The man.
Now, the shadow in general, the fact that she is discovered in the shadows,
Is that mysteriousness that we don't know where she's coming
unclear
from.
about
Right.
her parentage. Correct.
Okay, so now we've broken down one of the major symbols, or I guess two of the major symbols here. What's another symbol we see happening in the short story?
The description of the plantation,
Okay, so this is on the next page,
page 176.
page 176. We see a description, I'm going to read it out loud to you, of the plantation. It's talking about when Madame Valmont came to visit her daughter after giving birth to the baby. It says, when she reached L'Abri is the name of the plantation. They often name their plantations. She shuddered at the first sight of it, as she always did. It was a sad-looking place, which for many years had not known the gentle presence of a mistress. Old Monsieur Aubigny, having married and buried his wife in France, and she having loved her own land too well to ever leave it. The roof came down steep and black like a cow, reaching out beyond the wide galleries that encircled the yellow stuccoed house. Big solemn oak trees or oaks grew close to it, and their thick-leaved, far-reaching branches shadowed it like a paw. So, what can we say is symbolic of this place? The fact that it's described with such darkness and gloominess, that is symbolic in and of itself of the atmosphere there, right? This is not a place of gaiety and happiness. This is a place of depression and sadness, and bad things are happening there, right? Obviously, we know when we're reading a short story or a longer story of some type, any type of literature, and we come across a place that's described this dark, something's going on there, right? Something bad. Okay, so besides that, are there specific things within the description that we want to talk about as symbols?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to go and get into colors, the color of the house.
Yellow,
house.
sick. Yellow is often signified as a color of sickness. So they're saying something sick is happening here.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the cow, the steep roof that hangs over. So many of us know this without really thinking about it. When you see a roof that has a long overhang, meaning it's going way out over the edge of the building, what does that do to the ground underneath? Think about any house that you've ever been to where there's a steep overhang.
It ruins the fertility of it. It doesn't get enough sunlight.
Right. So that area doesn't get enough sunlight. It becomes muddy, murky, fungus growing there, right? Fungus usually grows off the dead leaves and stuff that are there. So we can imagine this, and it's saying basically the entire outline of the house has this nasty, murky, death-filled aura around the house, okay? And then it talks about the oaks and the far-reaching branches, right? So what can we assume that's a symbol of? Like when you see oak trees far-reaching, it reminds us of like skeleton fingers, right? Mm-hmm. Reaching out over this house. So if we envision this, if we're looking at it in our head and we think about these skeleton-like fingers reaching over, that makes us think of death, doom. Like it's just a creepy place, right? None of us, this is not a place we would hear this description and say, oh, I want to go there. That's my next vacation destiny. Okay, so in some other major symbols. And we mentioned color, the color yellow on the stuccoed house. We have a lot of colors that are going on in this that are symbolic. We talked about white often being referenced toward Desiree and meaning purity, innocence. And we talked about the house being yellow and meaning sickness. It's also mentioned right afterwards that the nurse, Zandrine, is yellow. Why would she exemplify sickness? Well, think about those relationships we talked about, right? The whole atmosphere of what was happening during this time period was a sickness, right? The masters are raping these women, producing these children who are yellow, and now having to also be slaves and then become raped. So it's, yes, very, very sick atmosphere. Okay? So continue. Besides colors. Oh, there was.
I've got to stick on colors for just a
Okay.
second.
Yeah, I was going to say there's some more I haven't mentioned.
Kate Chopin uses the symbolism of color amazingly in this, and she frames Desiree's innocence using color. The first time they talk about the baby is when Desiree's mom is coming to see the baby, and the first thing she says, the young mother, this is on the bottom of page 176, says the young mother was recovering slowly and lay full length in her soft white muslins and laces upon the couch, which means even right after birth, they mention that she's wearing white, innocence,
Right.
purity. So that's the first mention of the baby.
And the baby's
Desiree's
also wearing white, right?
Correct. Now, if you transpose that with the last mention of Desiree, it talks about when she's leaving after she's gotten the baby, Desiree had not changed the thin white garment nor the slippers which she wore. Had not changed the white garment.
Right. So
which means
she's still innocent.
innocent.
Right.
Even through all of this and all of the accusations,
Right.
that she's still innocent. Kate Chopin also uses color very well when it says that her hair was uncovered and the sun's rays brought a golden gleam. Its meshes.
I'm doing this
sort of
because
like a halo,
kind of like a halo,
once
that
again,
golden gleam off her
showing
hair.
innocence
And piety.
piety.
Yes, showing piety.
Culpability.
So let's also, it talks about her gray eyes, and I think that's significant. It's the only time gray is mentioned. The eyes are what? Windows. Say it louder. Windows to the soul, right? And her eyes are gray. So we can think of the grayness meaning that mysteriousness. Often they say things are black or white, and then they say no, there's some gray areas, meaning things that we're not really sure about. We will never know for sure if Desiree is 100% white, or if maybe she has a drop of black blood in her.
We won't know because
We will never know. And that's the gray, right? We can never know if she was 100% white, but that's the point. It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter, right? Because she was innocent. Okay, so off of colors, what is another symbol besides the colors?
The letter that he receives, that he finds from his mother.
Yes, that's symbolic of papers, right? I've talked about papers a few times in this discussion already. The papers, the paper trail that follows the black people in their struggle to kind of get out of being property, right? Mm-hmm. And here, Armand has always been considered white. He's the master of the house. And at the very end, he ends up finding his papers that actually signify that he is a slave or was born a slave. And what can we assume he did with those papers? The ones that he finds at the end.
He burned them.
He's already got a bonfire. Just throw that on the bonfire. Yeah. Because, again, this goes back to that ancestral pride and heritage. He is too proud of that name, Aubigny, that he carries with him. Even though he finds out that he is part black, he's the only one who knows it. So he's going to burn those papers. And all of that is symbolic, right? Symbolic of freedom, symbolic of slavery. So we've talked about some symbols. There are a few other symbols in there that we haven't talked about, but I'll let you guys find those and talk about them in your papers. I want to talk about irony as a literary concept because obviously this is an entire story about irony, right? So some of the main things about irony that you noticed.
There's so much irony in it. It's ironic that when he first met her, or when he first fell in love with her, he didn't care anything about her, where she came from, because he was so in love.
Right.
But then as soon as he realized that it might lower his status in the world, then all of a sudden he was very concerned.
Right. So also, I mean, the whole, like you said, the whole thing is irony. So let's talk about the big irony. He sends his wife and child off into the wilderness to die. And I don't mean that he told them to do that, but he basically did because he did not care if they left, is what he told her. And come to find out it's his fault.
Right.
Right? So that's ironic.
What's more ironic to me is his behavior and the way he acts. And you would think it's because he was raised that way.
But his father, we know,
left the country just to marry a slave.
Right. So his father was much more sympathetic to the plight of slaves. And what's ironic is he becomes this horrible master. And he's the one who is actually has slave blood in him. So that's very ironic. I think it's also ironic to think about the fact that the mother and father, Lady Valmond and Monsieur Valmond, they take in this child without knowing its background, without knowing anything about it. And they love it. And before, like you said, he is offered that opportunity to find her ancestry, and the mother and father, they want him to find the ancestry because they love their child and they don't want to send her off without being sure about what her future holds. And he assures them, no, everything's going to be fine. I love her. I don't need to know the background. They end up losing the child that they cherished, that they loved, that they found and took care of her whole life because they did not care enough to find out her background. It was that symbol of love. We don't care. We're going to just let it pass, and we are being assured that she's being taken care of because she's at one of the oldest and finest and proudest names in Louisiana. Like, these are good people. We're going to send her off, and we can know that she's going to be taken care of because we all love her so much that we don't care about her background. And then it was exactly that love that killed her, because when it come out that we really don't know, and maybe she does have slave blood in her, she was cast out, cast aside, and they wanted her back. They said, come back home. But she was too invested in the love that she had for her mom. So that's a tragic irony there that happened. Okay, so again, more irony in the story. We're not going to go into all that. But I do want you to continue to look for these literary concepts. So the last thing I want to talk about are similes and metaphors. Okay, so there are a ton of similes and a few metaphors in here. And remember, we can find those and focus on those and talk about those to help focus the bigger picture of the story for us in terms of proving our thesis. So what are some of these? Just mention some of your favorite similes.
Probably my favorite simile is when he saw her on page 176, when he first falls in love with when Armand first falls in love with Desiree, when he saw her at the gate, swept along like an avalanche, or like a prairie fire, or like anything that drives headlong over all obstacles.
So we heard all those likes, right? So that means simile.
3 similes.
And basically, this simile is describing his passion for her. And it's talking about all these destructive things, right? I don't want to be in a prairie fire or an avalanche. So these things that are talking about what it seems like a good thing is actually a bad thing. That passion can also become very volatile. I like one right before it where it talks about he fell in love with her as all the Aubigny's did. And can you read that one? It's right above
Yeah,
that
it's
one.
right above that. It's at the very end of page 175, start of page 176. That is the way all Aubigny's fell in love, as if struck by a pistol shot.
Is that how you want to fall in love? I don't want to feel like I'm struck by a pistol shot if I fall in love. So again, it's talking about, the simile is talking about the destructive nature of his love, right? So I like both of those as well. Another simile I want to talk about is the one that is talking about the bed, like a throne. This is on page, I believe, 178.
Yeah.
Where it's talking about one of LeBlanche's little quadroon boys fanning him. And it says, let me find it.
She sat in the room one hot afternoon. That's the paragraph that starts.
Right.
The
The baby, half naked, lay asleep upon her own great mahogany bed that was like a sumptuous throne. Okay? So it's talking about this bed being like a throne, and it's got the baby on it. So this simile can be kind of also a symbol for the heir, right? The baby is the heir to the throne, the heir to the plantation, the master's child, legitimate child. So that's another simile. Any other similes we want to talk about? I mean, there are a billion similes in this.
Yeah, there's.
She sat like a stone image. I remember that one.
Yeah, that's on page 179 at the bottom. That's one of my favorites.
And what does this mean? Like, if you're like a stone image, do stones have feelings? Desiree has always been overly emotional about things, right?
Right.
And at this point, she's kind of drained of all feeling because she's, shocked and stunned into submission. So she's still and she's unfeeling. So yeah, lots of similes. What are some of the metaphors that you would want to bring up?
A good one's at the bottom of page 178. The blood turned. No, that's a simile. The blood turned like ice in her veins.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so at the top of 179, her face, the picture of fright.
Picture of fright. Her face, the picture of fright. So here we're talking about the metaphor. And her face is the picture of fright because, again, she's realizing all that this might mean for her life and her child's life, right? And there's horrible repercussions if he treats her like a slave, right? What's another metaphor that you want to talk about?
Another metaphor, but it kind of ties into irony too, is on page 180, where she says, "Goodbye, Armand," she moaned. He did not answer her. That was his last blow at fate.
Right.
It's saying his lack of an answer was like a blow on their relationship.
On her destiny, her fate.
Her fate.
And
it's just ironic that his last action
was
as her
inaction.
husband was
Yeah.
inaction.
So yes, let me see. Are there some metaphors at the beginning that we might want to talk about? Because we've stuck kind of toward the end.
is mostly simile heavy at the beginning and just background. Um,
Seems like there was one at the beginning that I wanted to talk about. Okay, well, there are plenty in there for you guys to find similes, metaphors, but I want us to go back through our list, okay? So we've talked about the themes. That's going to be important for you coming up with your thesis, right? We've talked about the plot analysis. We've talked about the similes and metaphors, the symbols, the irony. We've talked about the setting and the characters. So now that we've broken down this short story for you, it's going to be up to you to carry it on through for your paper. You need to go out and first think of your thesis. What is it you're trying to say about this short story? What theme is most important and why? Once you come up with that thesis, then you need to go out and start doing some research. Keep in mind you only got a couple weeks, so this needs to be a quick process. I would say come up with that thesis today. Do some preliminary research today. Find some sources that will help back up your thesis. See what other people are saying about this short story. Then go through and organize your thoughts. List the literary concepts that you think are really going to help prove your thesis, and then list at least 3 supporting details or examples of how those literary concepts are used within the short story to help prove your thesis. Okay, so on Thursday, you will be meeting online with the Writing Center, talking to them about where you're at in your paper and what you need help with. Again, this is not a rough draft peer review, but it is required for your attendance on Thursday that you meet with some of the Writing Center staff on the online writing lab. And this can be any time Thursday, but you do need to meet with them, okay? And then on next Tuesday, I will send some instructions through Canvas and your email on what we're going to be doing on next Tuesday. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me through email, and I'd be happy to help you with any of that. But remember, research through the library only. Okay, so I know the library is not open, but you can use their online services and find some articles there. Okay, so hopefully everybody's staying well, and I will see you guys soon.